Hello again, friends! Welcome back to Office Hours with the Professor, the show that's proudly irrelevant. So, today we're continuing our Human Origins Caveman series, but you might see from the title, I'm changing the name. The new name of the series is Cavemen Rock, since obviously rocks, cavemen, ha ha ha. It's so obvious. I don't know why I didn't think of this. Even now, my friend is the one that suggested it to me. Oh well. You can also see I'm no longer in Thailand. I'm back at home in Colorado. Going to spend a few weeks here before heading up to Alaska to start my master's. So I'll have a nice little time here to chill out and take a rest. Anyway, let's move on. So, last time we talked about the species known respectively as Homo ergaster and Homo erectus in the context of respectively African and Asian assemblages. Now, I've also heard the expression African Homo erectus used, but I'm not sure what the difference is between that and ergaster. I think it's just a lumper splitter thing, right? So, I really want to emphasize the continuity between these two species, right? So if you do know if there's a difference between African Homo erectus and Homo ergaster, let me know, but I'm not going to focus on that. So I do have my own little name for these guys because they really are more of a continuum than two separate species. I like to call them ergectus. So that's what I'm going to start saying. So ergectus, as I've recently taken to calling these guys, they held on from almost 2 million years ago until well into the last 500,000 years, maybe even as recently, relatively speaking, as 150. Yeah, right? So during this time, we've seen the emergence of true hunting and gathering culture, sporadic fire use, maybe even some primitive seafaring. We also see the very first glimmerings of human consciousness, right, as we know it. Care for the elderly and the infirm. We have family units. Maybe there was even a sense of the aesthetic in their wonderfully napped hand axes, right? So let's take a look at Ian Davidson from the University of New England. Okay, and he has this really cool talk on YouTube. Check it out. But by the Ergectus era, anyway, according to him, our ancestors were able to control our vocal utterances independently of our emotional states. Okay, so Ergectus was able to make sounds voluntarily without some kind of emotional stimulus. And indeed, the vertebrae of the classic Turkana specimen show human like vocal capabilities. So these creatures may have had names even for the things around them or had names themselves, although I doubt they had anything close to what we would call articulated language. Still, as with Homo habilis, I don't think we could have interacted with Ergectus in the same way that we interact with each other, right? So, as evidenced by Grandpa George and Turkana Boy, these guys they cared for sick members of their groups, but they probably still hadn't mastered the art, and this is an intricate and subtle art of not tearing each other apart when meeting new acquaintances. And this will factor quite strongly in today's discussion, so keep that in mind. So it was in this milieu around 1.2 million years ago that one European strain branched from the Ergectus lineage. Unlike Ergectus, these guys had more human-like facial features, especially in, according to Smithsonian Magazine, the shape of the nasal region and the presence of a facial depression above the canine teeth that we call the canine fossa. Okay. Now, that sounds like a really small difference, but these features are more gracile than those of Ergectus. And these guys who emerged in Europe, attested from the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain. They were christened Homo antecessor, or the pioneer man, by modern science.
You got a nasty reputation. We're in a sticky situation.
Now, Atapuerca is an important site, so let's familiarize ourselves with the area. This is a mountain range in northern Spain, although, to be honest, it looks more like a hill to me, something left over from a construction site. Maybe the name comes, since it's from Spain, maybe the name comes from Don Quixote's fevered imagination.
So tell me, is it true? They say there ain't nobody there.
I imagine him riding by these on Rocinante and saying, "Behold, Sancho, mountains soaring up to the heavens! Surely these peaks must hide the secrets of Dulcinea's enchantment." Or maybe I'm just a snob, being as I am from the heart of Colorado's majestic Rocky Mountains. At any rate, Atapuerca has a number of sites stretching across prehistory from the lower Paleolithic all the way through to the Bronze Age. And the finds here are quite remarkable for that diversity of time depth. Now, looking at Homo antecessor documented from this site, these guys were present between 1.2 and 0.78 meow, right? So behaviorally and technologically, they appear not to be markedly different from their ergectus brethren in that their tools are a continuation of, remember, the Acheulean industry, right? And we can tell by examining their teeth that they subsisted on tough, difficult to chew foods, so like roots and things. So this implies that, like Homo erectus, they did not have at least regular access to fire. Now, there is little else we know about antecessors' behavior, with the exception of one more point that I'd like to bring up now. And in fact, this is a bit of an elephant in the room. And if you've studied antecessor, I think you know where I'm going with this already. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's not that big of a deal, but and it's also not very nice to think about. But here goes. The bones of some antecessor specimens had the muscles removed with stone tools before the bones were scattered among the remains of game animals. The implication, I'm sorry, but the implication is that these individuals had been hunted, butchered, and eaten by other Homo antecessor. I know, I'm sorry, it's disgusting. I hate even talking about it. It's disgusting. And it's annoying to talk about because this stuff is heavily sensationalized by non-academic media. You know, it's weird. There's this deeply ingrained disgust, right? And that's not weird, but there's this deeply ingrained disgust that we feel at the idea of cannibalism, be it survival, mortuary, or otherwise. So, but the weird thing is that this is what the non-academic press likes to jump on, I guess, is like a clickbait preying on our involuntary disgust. We also see it in caveman movies, from Quest for Fire to one of my favorites, The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. It's just this, I don't know, it's this clickbait that we associate with cavemen. And I don't know why it's such a big deal in our popular perception of cavemen, but there it is. It may be related to the racist image of the cannibal savage that was used to justify Western imperialism during the Age of Exploration. That is to say, focusing on this behavior among our ancestors may be a way of distancing ourselves from them and making them out to be inferior to us. I don't know, though, and it's this gross, strange, bizarre, grotesque thing for everyone to dwell on as much as they do. And I wouldn't have mentioned it at this point at all. I'm sorry to do so if it didn't have an important implication 4 behaviors, so bear with me. First, eating these guys, antecessor eating other antecessors, appears not to have been ritual or funerary behavior, which is unsurprising since the mind of antecessor probably wasn't quite there yet to have these uh, ritualistic or even religious tendencies, right? We know in modern societies, many, well, not many, but there are modern societies that as part of a funerary ritual, they will consume the deceased. And that's a specific behavior that's associated with cultural behavioral modernity, right? Now we know this is not the case with antecessor because the bones were treated exactly the same way as those of game animals. Okay, so if we belong to one of these cultures where the body of the dead, this loved one, was consumed, we wouldn't scatter the bones around in the trash, right? We would treat the body with respect, and that didn't happen here. So what exactly did happen? Well, one easy explanation is this. So let's say we're hanging around in the cave and one of my bros keels over and dies. Well, eating him is kind of a convenient thing to do since it A, gets rid of the body, and B, oh great, now we don't have to go hunting that day. We can stay home, we can crack some cave brews, and we can play Cave Mario Kart, right? Well, that's possible. But why, if that's the case, why don't we see evidence of doing that with Grandpa George or Turkana Boy? Why weren't the bones of Grandpa George and Turkana Boy similarly treated if that was the case? The latter of these was old and weak, and the former was dead from an infection. Sorry, the former was old and weak, and the latter was dead from an infection. Sorry, neither of these guys were cannibalized. So antecessor is almost 1,000,000 years and thousands of miles removed from Grandpa George and Turkana Boy, so perhaps it's not that appropriate to bring them into the discussion, but it is important to think about. So if it was within the community, why weren't the bones of Grandpa George and Turkana Boy treated the same way? Another possibility is that there was a famine or something like this, and there was that thing that happens in cartoons where you're looking at your friend and your friend turns into a giant talking steak, right? But by all reconstructions, the environment of that time wouldn't have made this area a very difficult place to live. That said, there's always the possibility of a lean season. So let's look one more time for clues at the individuals that became dinner. So let's examine the butchered remains, and looking at these remains, we realize a commonality shared by the victims. These individuals were children as young as 10 years old. And again, that's disgusting, disturbing. I know, sorry. But that fact is important because we see a parallel behavior among chimpanzees. Male chimps, adult male chimps, when patrolling their territory, will kill and eat infants that they come across. We could be seeing a similar behavior here. The juvenile Homo antecessor specimens that were eaten could have been members of an outgroup encountered by adult males on patrol. One problem with this scenario, of course, is that 10 years old isn't exactly an infant, right? Unless we're speaking French. Indeed, we know from other specimens, one of them being Turkana Boy, that archaic hominins reached adolescence much faster than kids today. Turkana Boy was 8 when he died, but had adolescent skeletal morphology. Antecessor was about 800,000 years after Turkana Boy. So even if the rate had slowed somewhat during the intervening time, it still would be reasonable to guess that a 10-year-old antecessor might have already entered adolescence. In that case, this situation would differ even more from that of the modern chimpanzee behavior, since the killed infants of outgroups are eaten, but for some reason killed adults or are not. At least such behavior has not yet been observed among chimpanzees. For this reason, it's important not to discount the in-group death or the famine hypotheses. Still, to me at least, the patrol hypothesis, this idea that we just talked about, similar to the chimpanzees, seems to me the most probable, or at any rate the least improbable. That is to say, the cannibalized Homo antecessor remains found in Atapuerca represent the same phenomenon, the same behavior observed among male chimpanzee patrols today. And this has very serious implications for our attempt to reconstruct the behavior of archaic hominins at this time. Okay? So, and remember, this whole series is focusing on behavior. So this is really important. If, in fact, the patrol hypothesis is true, it provides a serious counterpoint to the various baby steps that we've seen in the progression toward modern behavior. Now, we've seen Ergectus care for its elderly and sick. We've seen them map symmetrical tools, probably use fire, and very possibly even use rafts and simple word-like utterances, right? But for all that, the discovery of these poor antecessor kids demonstrates starkly that raw animal instinct still had a heavy influence upon these creatures, at least in terms of their dealings with outgroups. So deep down, by the antecessor stage, they were still in many ways quite far from human in terms of behavior and cognition. Do you remember way back at the beginning of the series, probably a year ago now, when I talked about a mark of peopleness as being morally responsible for your actions, right? People are morally responsible for their actions. If the patrol hypothesis explains this incident, Homo antecessor and its Ergectus predecessors were not morally responsible for what they did. So chimpanzees, they don't think about cannibalizing the infants that they kill on patrols. It's just something that's hardwired into their brains and may have been hardwired into the brains of early Homo. So how could we test if the patrol hypothesis is true? We would have to look at other fossils of the same time period and before with a special eye toward both juvenile bones and those which show evidence of having been butchered. If there's an overlap, perhaps this hypothesis is worth considering. So let's kind of step back into the Wu-Tang time traveling elevator, right? Go back to 1.2 Mia in Spain. Okay, and from a safe distance, we're watching what happens, and maybe a little squeamishly too. But as scientists, we have to stand back and observe, right? So here's what I think happened. One day, there's some Homo antecessor males, and they're walking around patrolling their territory. All right, and they knew that there were other antecessor groups in the area with whom they occasionally clashed in conflicts not unlike those between modern chimpanzee troops. Okay, so along they came, minding their own business, when in the distance they saw some punk kids skateboarding on their driveway, or the lower Paleolithic equivalent of punk kids skateboarding on their driveway. And the kids, they knew that they should stay off the other group's territory. However, they were acting with the same rashness and impulsiveness characteristic of today's 12 or 13-year-olds, and they paid the price. The patrolling males ran them down, killed them, and ate them without really considering what they were doing. They acted entirely on impulse. Had the victims been adults, the patrol would simply have killed them and then wandered off and left the bodies. But juveniles, for whatever evolutionary reason, triggered a different response. Whatever explanation this behavior had, it is the same thing that we observe today among chimps, and as a result, shows the behavioral distance that still remains between us and these guys. So, to sum up, here was a creature that was capable of touching tenderness toward members of their in-groups, but remained quite aggressive toward members of out-groups, which, if you think about it, is quite human in a way. Goodness knows that we have enough trouble today with racism and xenophobia. But unlike them, we modern people have gained the amazing ability to think through our actions and consciously decide to cooperate with members of outgroups rather than instinctively kill them. And I think there's a lesson for us today when we look at this story. When we give in to these base xenophobic judgmentalism, we are stooping to the same level as these these pre-human creatures, and so don't be a caveman, right? Be accepting of others, I guess. I don't know. So anyway, uh, in my discussion of Grandpa George and Turkana Boy, I talked about how these two cases, Grandpa George and Turkana Boy, they demonstrate how the goodness of humanity outdates humanity itself. Well, we could say, in the same vein, that the antecessor finds show us that humanity's bad side goes back a long way also. So, to any Paleolithic kids out there, stay off old man antecessor's lawn. Bye, guys.